the NAACP lawyers had decided to make an attack on segregation. And at the time, by 1950, which was the first argument I had made in the Supreme Court, a case was decided which held at the graduate level that segregation itself was a denial of equal educational opportunities. And on the basis of that decision, we decided in the NAACP that the time was ripe to make an all-out attack on segregation at the elementary school level.
Does segregation of children in public schools solely on the basis of race, even though the tangible factors may be equal, deprive the children of the minority group of equal educational opportunities? We believe that it does. We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. The court's decision divided the country. White Southern reaction was angry and defiant. The man who argued more cases before the Warren Court than anyone else, Jack Greenberg.
The Brown decision ran into such severe opposition, particularly from the southern states, that we had almost a series of minor revolutions on our hands. We had Little Rock and New Orleans. We had all the declarations of interposition and nullification. We had the Congress of the United States, or the Senate in any event, coming within a single vote of stripping the court of its jurisdiction. And during this period of time, that is shortly after 54 and 55, the court did very little with regard to implementation, except to sort of play its role in declaring that these revolutions, that is Little Rock and the like, could not stand. The educational effect of the court's work, however, was profound during this period of time, and what happened was what became known as the movement began. And the court played its role with regard to that. It protected those in the movement who were being arrested and clubbed by police and so forth, protected their First Amendment rights of free speech, and ultimately the principles proclaimed by the court and the activism of the movement led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 1965, at which point Congress and the executive branch, the president and the court, had all caught up with one another.
After the court ruled for the concept of school integration, it set out in 1955 to ensure implementation. It called for integration in public schools with all deliberate speed. This phrase was widely interpreted in the South as a signal that the court would tolerate delay, so the pace of integration was painfully slow. Eventually, the court became impatient with this open defiance and ruled in 1964 that further delays in desegregating school systems are no longer tolerable. In a recent decision, the court has provided strict criteria of compliance. For Jack Greenberg, it was another important victory.
In last term of court, in case of Green against New Kent County, the court proclaimed that a desegregation order must work in order to be effective. It wasn't enough to have formal provisions like freedom of choice, which permit intimidation or permit the old habits of segregation to continue.
So on the campaign trail, Trump didn't talk much about K-12 policy, but when he did, he talked about school choice. And Betsy DeVos is a longtime school choice advocate. So we can expect that this administration is going to make good on its promise to make school choice a huge priority.
In desegregating a formally segregated system, you have to have standards which actually bring about abolition of the previous two sets of schools. You have to end up with a single unitary school system. The Supreme Court essentially said was, look, we're not interested in excuses, it just got to work. And if you can't make it work any other way, and this is the way to make it work, well, this is how it's got to be.
Having said that the court's record in the race relations field is excellent, I have to make some modifications. One, I think that the court was in error in its all deliberate speed formula in terms of the implementation of Brown. The court had good reasons for doing this, But this is a part of what blacks are now complaining about. I think a part of the business that blacks are now complaining about, because what the court really did in that decision was to say that we will sacrifice the rights of the individual black child to equal educational opportunity and postpone it and put it off in order that this decision will become more palatable and more acceptable to the white majority.
So school segregation is much the same as what it was during Jim Crow, except that it's not mandated by law. And so what we mean when we say that schools are segregated today are that you have large numbers of particularly Black and Latino students who are in schools with no other racial groups, who are in schools where they are isolated both by race and today often by poverty. The measures are typically large numbers of Black and Latino students in schools that are 90% or more Black and Latino, and segregated typically away from white and Asian students.
A new report finds school segregation is on the rise across the United States, even though it has been 65 years since the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional. The landmark Brown versus Board of Education case ordered schools to start integrating in 1954, launching a movement to help end racial inequality. But according to research conducted by the Civil Rights Project, a series of Supreme Court decisions in the 1990s led to the end of hundreds of desegregation orders and plans across the country. Gary Orfield joins us now from Los Angeles. He is a professor of education, law, political science, and urban planning at UCLA. He is also the co-director of the Civil Rights Project at the university. Gary, good to have you with us.
Good to be with you.
So, Gary, first, if you can explain what happened in the 1990s and how did these rulings affected integration in schools?
So there was a lot of progress especially from the 1960s through the late 1980s. We made the South into the most integrated part of the United States, thanks to court orders and desegregation plans, and we achieved a lot of educational gains. Beginning at the end of the 1980s and early 90s, we began to turn backwards. In 1991, the Supreme Court, in a case from Oklahoma City, said that desegregation was a temporary punishment, not a long-term requirement, and allowed school districts to return to segregated neighborhood schools and actually put pressure on court judges to end desegregation. Ever since that time, segregation's been increasing.
You know, I found this research to be really disappointing and surprising. I wonder, were any of the results surprising to you, that after 65 years after Brown versus Board of Education, that school segregation is actually getting worse?
No, it's been getting worse now for over a quarter century. People just aren't paying any attention to it because they don't intend to do anything about it. We really did learn that if you worked on it, you could achieve desegregation and it would have benefits. But there was a tremendous resistance to it, and when the court gave the go-ahead to end the desegregation plans, many places ended them. There were some school districts that wanted to remain desegregated that weren't allowed to by the courts as the courts turned more conservative.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Charlotte, North Carolina was a good example of that, where the school district actually spent $1 million saying, we're not done yet. We haven't made the schools equal enough yet. And our people like desegregation. And the court ordered them to terminate the plan and reinstate neighborhood schools that were highly segregated and very unequal.
What is it you wanted me to reconcile myself to? I was born here almost 60 years ago. I'm not going to live another 60 years. You always told me it takes time. It has taken my father's time, my mother's time, my uncle's time, my brother's and my sister's time, my nieces and my nephew's time. How much time do you want for your progress?